Today we are cutting rocks, like literally chopping them in two, so that we can use them as the base for a bench that's carved out of a reclaimed wood beam. The goal is to make a high-end piece of furniture out of inexpensive materials, only using a few basic power tools. Let's start with the stones. These are white lapis, which I bought for about $8 each. I want to put a flat side on each one, and I want them to be the same height. So I built some little nests around them to hold them up in the vertical position, just using scrap wood. After checking to make sure my table was level, I then ran a laser across them. Now I can just trace a line over the laser and just rotate them around so that I have a level mark around the entire circumference. The majority of this project is fabricated with a single angle grinder. I put on a diamond blade and just cut right along the line. Now the angle grinder only cuts in about 1.25 inches or so before the housing starts to bump into the stone. Now the question becomes how to separate the two pieces, since I can't cut all the way through with a 4.5-inch blade. The crude and wasteful way is just to obliterate the smaller half that you don't want. Now that I had a clean score line all the way around, I could just make cuts on the throwaway end and then use a hammer to chip the pieces off. This took about 2 hours of total labor time, but I had to go slower because the blade on the angle grinder kept getting really hot. This blade was about $32, and obliterating this one part of the stone used up about half of its life. The closer I got to the cut line, the slower I had to go, just to make sure I was creating a nice flat surface that would sit firmly on the floor. For the second rock, I decided to risk it all and to try to crack it along the score line. So I just shoved in a piece of 1/8 inch thick steel and then pounded it in and split it into two pieces. Now with this rock I did deepen the score line by running it across my tabletop tile saw. The break was pretty clean, and I tried out this aluminum carving disc that's meant for stone, and this was a much more effective tool for smoothing out the cut surface. Link in the description. I want the curved piece of wood to look like it's just balancing on top of the stone. So to secure the pieces together, I'm going to use a steel pin. I'm using my Ryobi hammer drill to drill a hole in the end, and I oversized the hole. The pin's going to be 5/8 of an inch in diameter, but I worked my way up to a 3/4 inch diameter drill bit. More on that later. The difference between a hammer drill and just a normal drill with a masonry bit is pretty incredible. That being said, I still think it's a little bit easier to gradually work your way up in terms of the bit's diameter. The construction of my new house is almost done, and there was a leftover piece of a 6x12 beam. It had been sitting in the dirt, and they had used it as sort of a sawhorse, so it was pretty nicked up. It has a lot of split ends, but still is a really substantial, beefy piece of wood. So I started sketching out my design right onto the wood itself. I used a Sharpie for this just so I can see the marks clearly through all the dust, and I just start with a very rough outline. I made a couple of circles where I think the rocks are going to meet the wood, and that just tells me to leave as much material as possible here. And then I just drew some angled lines along the sides of the beam. Now I do love some angle grinder carving, but it does make a lot of dust. So what I like to do here is to make a bunch of cuts with my Japanese pull saw and then get one of the machetes out of my collection and start hacking away to really hog out the rough shape. This is really fun, dare I say therapeutic, and you can remove a lot of material real fast. Now, I'm not trying to precision carve with a machete, so I kept my hacking within about 1 inch of where I want the finished profile to be. I have a rough idea for the design in my head, so I nibble away at first, then I look at it, and then I go, oh, gotta remove a lot more material here. And so sometimes I step up to a faster way of making a cut and just use the circular saw. I really like these spiny carving discs that go onto an angle grinder. They've removed material really fast, and they don't chip out the wood too much. So now I can just blend away all the chop marks and start to see the smooth contours of the piece. Everything was looking a little bit too chunky, so I drew some more aggressive lines so I could really start to taper those outer edges and get them to be nice and thin. I really want this piece to look like the wood is wide at the top and then flows down to a curve that just gently touches the curve of the stone. So the bench is currently upside down, and you can see these two islands forming on either ends where the stone's going to touch. Originally, I wanted to keep as much of the length as possible, but after doing a lot of the carving, I saw that the splits were going pretty far down, so I did have to sacrifice about 2 inches on either end. And when you see how easily these end pieces break, I think you'll understand why I had to do this. I drilled 3/4 inch diameter holes on the center of each of the wood islands, and I drilled these 3.5 inches deep. Now this wood has some cracks in it and is a little bit splintery, so I do want to leave a healthy amount of wood around where the steel pin is going to go into the wood, but I don't want it to look too chunky in the profile, so I just gently rounded over the islands into a nice gradual hill. This involved a lot of sanding with the orbital sander and 60 grit pads. I went through about 5 or 6 of them. Steel into stone is fine, but I feel a steel rod right into a wood hole would get wobbly over time. So I cut some steel tube that's 3.25 inch in diameter that slides right over this solid 5/8 inch rod. I picked up these steel pieces from Home Depot, which is kind of an expensive place to buy steel, but they had what I needed. I can now use 2-part epoxy to glue these steel sleeves into the 3/4 inch diameter holes. I want this thing to come apart easily, so I was careful not to get any epoxy on the inside of the steel tube. Now one of them I cut a little too long, so I just used a flap disc to grind it down flush. I'm continually amazed at how versatile an angle grinder is. Just in this project I cut stone, carved wood, and cut and ground steel. Now, remember when I said I over-drilled the holes in the rocks? That's so I could put epoxy into them and the 5/8 inch rods would have a little room to wiggle. Now, I did this because I assumed I wouldn't be able to drill the holes perfectly straight. And this epoxy is super strong and will fill in the gaps between the steel and the rock. This way I can put on the wood top and let the epoxy cure in the ideal locations for each of the steel pins. Once the epoxy had fully cured, I could really start to see how the bench was going to look, and I just carved from the top down in a way that really emphasizes the location of the stones. And yes, this did involve a lot of orbital sanding. I put some plastic bags on my rocks, wiped the dust off of the wood, and then applied a coat of Minwax polyacrylic. Now you can see there's still some cracks in the wood, and I'll show you later how I filled those in with epoxy. But first I want to do a fit check. The wood top comes off and on relatively easily, yet there's almost no wiggle in the top even when I'm standing on it. It's really solid. Aesthetically, I do think I achieved that kind of balancing look, and you don't really see the steel. You just see a curved piece of wood hit a curved piece of stone. Now, about those cracks. The wood seems pretty stable, but I don't want them to get worse, so I taped up the bottoms with some painter's tape, and then mixed up some Total Boat tabletop epoxy. This is a real thick epoxy that cures relatively fast, and was planning on using these big syringes to inject it into the cracks, but it was too thick to suck up, so I had to pour it in. I was able to squeeze it out of the syringe, but the viscosity was so great that it really wasn't flowing deep into the cracks. It was kind of just creating bubbles along the surface, which I could kind of heat gun out, but just didn't really feel like it was penetrating all the way in. So I switched to Total Boat Thickset Fathom epoxy. This is a much thinner liquid, but it does take longer to cure. With this thinner mixture, I had no problem getting deep into the cracks. But I did have to wait about 3 to 4 days to let it fully cure before sanding down the top again and applying another coat of Minwax polyacrylic. I will be ordering more of these syringes though. I think these are going to come in handy since I often work with cracked wood. This is one of my favorite pieces that I've made this year. I feel like I got real good usage out of my favorite tool, the angle grinder. Structurally, it's way more solid than I expected, and I just think it looks good. Having a way to cut rocks and turn them into furniture components or building materials relatively easily feels super empowering to me creatively. I think a strategic use of rocks can reduce the material cost for a project versus using a hardwood, and at the same time differentiate it as a furniture piece if you plan on selling unique designs. And if you're a furniture maker, lowering your material costs and increasing your sale price are really good things. Now, there's some very obvious puns that you could use to describe this project, and hit me with them in the comment section below, just to let me know that you made it to the end. Thanks, everybody.